Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm the program director here at the Scholar. Thank you for joining us here in Harrisburg. We're happy you're here, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's event with Dr. Keisha Blain, Ruth Richardson, Taifa Smith Butler, and Burgin. Before we begin, some quick housekeeping notes as always. One, we have many more events coming up this winter and spring, including Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Finkel, New York Times bestselling author Eric Larson, and historian Nell Irving Painter. Please take an events flyer as you leave and stay tuned to our social media pages, website, and newsletter for event updates. Tonight, we have copies of Wake Up America available for purchase at the cafe. The authors are sticking around for a book signing after the event, and a quick reminder that book sales are so important for authors and bookstores and the sustainability of this event series. So we thank you in advance for your support and advocacy for the bookstore. At this time, I'm going to hand it off to Danielle Bowers, who is the president of the Harrisburg City Council, to introduce our speakers this evening. Let's give it up for Danielle.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Alex. I am thrilled to be here this evening. As Alex mentioned, my name is Danielle Bowers. I serve as the president of Harrisburg City Council. Please indulge me for just a few minutes as I share a poem written by Ntozake Shange. Somebody, anybody, sing a black girl song. Bring her out to know herself, to know you, but sing her rhythms. Sing her sighs, sing the song of her possibilities. Sing a righteous gospel, the making of a melody. Let her be born and handled warmly. Black women's voices are valid. Black women's voices are needed. And Black women's voices and collective work have saved our democracy time and time again. To those Black women named and unknown, thank you. It is my honor to introduce our speakers this evening. Our moderator is Burgin. Is the assistant professor in the Department of History at Dickinson College. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Organizing Your Own: The White Fight for Black Power in Detroit. Dr. Keisha N. Blain is professor of Africana Studies and History at Brown University. She is a columnist for MSNBC, a Guggenheim Fellow, and author, most recently, of the National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, Until I Am Free. She resides in Providence, Rhode Island. Ruth Richardson is president and CEO of Planned Parenthood North Central States. Ruth started with PPNCS in October of 2022 and is the first Black woman to lead the 5-state affiliate, which consists of Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. PPNCS provides health care to over 100,000 patients annually and comprehensive sexual education throughout the region. Ruth has a BA in Sociology and History from the University of Minnesota and a JD from William Mitchell College of Law. Taifa Smith Butler began her tenure as Demos president in July of 2021. She brings more than 20 years of experience in strategic communications, public policy research, and data analysis in the public, nonprofit, and private sectors. Named one of Atlanta's 500 most powerful leaders in 2020 and 2021 by Atlanta Magazine, Taifa has served on various local, state, and national committees and boards. A first-generation college student, she graduated from Mount Holyoke College and holds a master's in public management and policy with a concentration in economic development and financial management from the Hines School of Public Policy and Management at Carnegie Mellon University. Of course, the book we are here for this evening is titled Wake Up, America, Black Women on the Future of Democracy. Ibram X. Kendi calls the book as urgent as it is imperative. Mark Lamont Hill says, Wake Up, America is a monumental achievement that brims with incisive political critique, ambitious freedom dreaming, and principled calls to action. We're honored to welcome these renowned speakers to the stage. So, without further ado, please join me in giving them a warm Harrisburg welcome.
Good evening, and happy Black History Month. I'm excited and I'm honored to be with you all tonight and moderating this illustrious, wonderful panel. And I'm gonna get right to it. I wanna start with a question that might involve conversation to all of you. Can you please talk to us about what is at stake in democracy right now and how this book helps us to see those stakes?
Thank you so much. Excellent question. And thank you all for coming out this evening. I know there's so many things you could be doing, so it's wonderful that you chose to be here. Where to begin? I think for so many people, January 6th was perhaps a moment where I know, certainly I suspect this is true for many of you, felt a sense perhaps of disbelief. I think just watching the events unfold, I remember being home, I remember breaking news, and I was trying to make sense of what I was looking at. And I think in the days following the January 6th events, people kept talking about the threat to democracy. And it was important, I think, to have that conversation because so many times when we point out the fact that our democracy is at risk or perhaps in crisis, it's easy to think, well, you're being alarmist, stop being so dramatic. We're not about to become some dictatorship, or we're not about to become some other kind of institution. And ultimately, I think that moment woke people up, to go back to the title of the book, Wake Up America. It certainly woke lots of people up to the reality that, in fact, a democracy is something that you have to fight continually to protect, to uphold. It doesn't just sort of happen and you build a democracy, you step back, and that's it. The United States is a democracy, we can just relax. That's not the case. And I think this book is a reminder of two things. One, it really points out the ways that our democracy simply continues to be at risk, but the way that it's continually eroding, even one might say dramatically, just in the last 10 years. If you look at the essays in the book, many of the authors speak about the concerns around voting, and Taifa will talk about that tonight, voting access. What does it mean when Americans have to struggle to cast the ballot, right? That's a dangerous thing to have in a democracy, because what is a democracy if not access to the vote, if not making sure that the will of the people can be heard? And so I think the book points out the dangers, but it also, I think, gives us hope, and that's what I wanted. I didn't want it to put together a collection of doom and gloom. There is doom and gloom in the book, but but I wanted the collection to ultimately do something similar to what civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer did. Every time she spoke, she would tell you the truth of what was going on. And sometimes people felt uncomfortable, people felt uneasy when she spoke about the problems in American society. And then she would leave you with some practical steps. She would say, okay, well, this is where we are, and this is where we need to go, and here's how we get there. And so that's what I wanted the book to do. I certainly think it does that. It helps us recognize many of the problems, and the truth is there are so many problems that they're not even all covered in the book. Think about that. 256 pages, and it's just about, I think, a fraction of the concerns that we're dealing with in this nation. But in those pages are just very practical, powerful, meaningful suggestions, recommendations from Black women representing diverse backgrounds. And for the Listen to Black Women crowd, the people who keep saying, you know, we need to listen to Black women, now there's an easy way to do it, right? Pick up the book. The next time someone tells you, oh, we need to listen to Black women, say, good, I hope you are. Here's a copy of the book. So, in a nutshell, I think this is really a pivotal moment, especially with the presidential elections approaching. I don't have to tell you that. I'm sure it's on your mind as it is on my mind. Definitely, I could not have predicted that we would be in this particular moment where we find ourselves on repeat, it seems. But nonetheless, it's a pivotal moment, and this is an important book, and I hope that it will be part of the conversation. So thank you for that.
And to just sort of build upon that, you know, Coretta Scott King said that freedom is something that has to be won in each successive generation. So it's not a one and done fight. It's an ongoing struggle, and it's about us holding our line, right, in that chain. And, you know, January 6th, I think, was a real marker. I think the Dobbs decision leaking as well was another. And when the Dobbs decision leaked, and I read the decision, and I heard people all over, you know, cable news saying, they're trying to push us back 50 years. I'm like, no, they're trying to push us back 250 years to an original intent reading of the Constitution. This is not just about coming for abortion access and contraception. They're coming for marriage equality. They're coming for Brown versus Board of Education. They are coming for fundamental rights. And we have seen this play out. I mean, it really set up the blueprint for what they were looking to dismantle. And we are going backwards with affirmative action and other pieces. And there's this real sort of centering that people are really trying to push us to have this sort of colorblind lens to approach these issues. We didn't get to this place by being colorblind, and we're not going to get out of it by pretending that color doesn't exist. And so I just think that it's really important to not only see those markers that are telling us, because they're telling us what they want to do, right? With January 6th, with the Dobbs decision, so we know the path forward that they are taking. But I think it's also really important with that hope piece, and that's the other thing that they're coming for. They're coming for our hope. They're coming for our joy, because they know if they can take away hope, then they've won. And so it is really important that we continue to have, like, not just faith, but the works that go along with that to continue this fight.
Thank you. I jokingly said while Dr. Blain was talking about the gloom and doom, certainly feel that, but also know as a Black leader leading an organization like Demos, who is committed to building a multiracial, inclusive democracy and economy, we cannot relent and we can't give up. And one of the things that inspired me as I took this role 2.5 years ago was thinking about the rising electorate. You know, in 2 decades, America is projected to be majority people of color. And so how do we get to this dream of this inclusive democracy when we know there is inequity in every facet of our democracy and our economy? and it was built that way on purpose, right? From the founding, and we're continuing to see even now, as we hit, in the 2020 election cycle where there was the biggest turnout, right, for the election. You saw Black and brown communities who have been typically excluded and marginalized show up in a real intentional way. And then we get this voter suppression, response. And as I have been doing this work for, 2 decades, particularly in the economic sphere, I've been on my journey all about learning how the connection of the democracy and the economy work. And I just remember reading, where we are in the history books is the same thing we're experiencing now. And so we are in a post-Reconstruction redemption period where we had 11 to 12 years of, multiracial, multicultural rule. And then there was this incredible clapback from white supremacists who said no more. And then we entered into the Black codes in the Jim Crow era. So when you hear these narratives today about white folks feeling like they're discriminated against and they're victims, it is the same messages we saw post-Reconstruction. And so if we're taking history books out of the classrooms and demanding, the analysis of critical race theory and systemic racism, these are all tactics and tools to undermine our ability to call out, sort of white supremacy and racism, the things that have created the inequities we see in our society. So, I feel like we've got to be on this education journey, particularly now, to protect, but also to defend. And if we're being honest, our young American democracy is on a precipice. We've still never fully realized justice and liberty for all, right? Because of the way this country was founded. And I think for us to be now further marginalized, for those of us who are about racial justice and racial equity, and now, for the narrative to say, hey, it's un-American to talk about racism, one, we didn't start it, like you said, Ruth, but we need to finish it, right? And so I'm just at this point where, and I just have to say this, because I think it's all connected. When we talk about the inequities that we see in our democracy, and like you said, Dr. Blain, access to the ballot is one piece of it, y'all, just a single piece. But when we talk about the threats of authoritarianism and how the government is trying to control, I heard this point from a trans activist, and she said, we are 1% of the American population, but yet there are 400 some odd bills that are threatening our very existence, our identity. And so she said, forget about authoritarianism tomorrow. We are dealing with a totalitarian government today. And so those are the things that we really have to keep in mind in terms of the threats.
Yeah, those were such rich points. I got goosebumps. Thank you all. And before we get into the individual pieces about violence against Black women and girls and voter access, I want to come to you, Dr. Blain, and ask a history question. So this volume is filled with a real rich diversity of voices. There are abolitionists, there are legislators, there are writers, organizers, there are queer and trans voices, young and elder voices. There are people working at local levels, national levels, international levels. Can you tell us, from your perspective as a historian, how this rich diversity of voices both echoes and departs from a longer lineage of Black women's calls to strengthen democracy?
Thank you. Also a great question. And in fact, it's something that I thought about as I was putting together the collection, because so many times when we think about Black women's history, what I found is that the emphasis tends to be primarily on civil rights movements. That's just the way it tends to be. I found that especially so when I was writing my first book, Set the World on Fire, which focuses on Black nationalist women. And when I would talk to editors about the book before I ended up securing a book contract, people kept trying to fit that particular story into the civil rights movement. And I kept saying, well, these are not civil rights activists per se. These are individuals who absolutely wanted expanded rights and freedom, but they really wanted to establish a Black nation state. And so then immediately some people lost interest in the story that I wanted to tell. And thankfully, I was able to publish the book. But one of the reasons why I have always been drawn to these kinds of stories is because I think it's important to understand that what we talk about as the Black intellectual tradition is such a rich one. Yes, mainstream narratives tend to focus on women who might have been involved in groups like the NAACP, the Urban League. That is absolutely important, or those who organize in local churches, absolutely important. But it's also significant to recognize that they were doing all of this work alongside of women who were involved in the Communist Party. And that particular group, also different from the Black nationalists, who were embracing capitalism, or rather a version of capitalism, a specific Black capitalism. And so what you find when you look at history is that people really do come to, one might say the topic or the theme or the goal of liberation, they come to it in different ways. Not everyone agrees that the answer is to fight for expanded civil rights within a nation. Others think that we need to go beyond the nation. They think that the borders, the geographical borders, are problematic as is, so break free from that. And they see themselves as citizens of the world. I think this collection captures the diversity in the way that the historical record tells us that all Black women activists didn't think alike. All Black women activists, they may have agreed on some things, they disagreed on others. It's simply the way that I think politics works. It's a messy kind of business. But fundamentally, I think this book shows that even if you're coming to this from a perspective where you don't actually, so some of the authors don't actually think this is a democracy, so that's interesting. Me asking them to contribute to this book on the future of democracy and them saying to me, well, I don't think this is a democracy. I said, that's okay, say so. Say it in your essay and explain why. Some people believe that all we need is a seat at the table. Others argue that, quite frankly, to hell with the table. Flip it upside down. We don't even need a table anyhow. So I said, that's fine, say that in your essay and explain why. And I think all of that is what really makes, I think, just our society just such an amazing and, I think just a rich experience for all of us, is that we're not all the same, right? And I think it would be a boring story historically, as it would be in the contemporary sense, if we all agreed on everything. So it truly comes out of a history of diversity, of thought, even though all of these individuals can be classified as progressive in the sense that they agree that we do need to provide a space where people of all backgrounds can be a part of this nation, this world. And so there's so many parallels for sure. And I'm really thrilled that I was able to capture the diversity of thought in this particular volume.
Thank you. So, Ms. Smith Butler, let's talk about your piece, which beautifully opens with your daughter's first voting, which was really incredible. So in your essay, which is on voting rights, you say, increased voter turnout and engagement alone will not dismantle the power structures holding us back. It will also take more than a single election cycle or intervention point to shift the balance of power. To expand protections for voting rights and to protect and bolster access to the ballot, we need to build models and systems that aim to protect rights and freedoms for all and to ensure that American democracy lives up to its ideals and values of freedom and liberty. And the essay goes on in some great detail to give some sense of what those protections and what that vision should be. And I'm wondering which of these you see as the most urgent of interventions for a place like Pennsylvania, but then also for the nation.
Thank you for that question, Say. I want to go back to Dr. Blain because, as Demos has been doing this work now at the intersection, like I said, of economic justice and democracy and racial justice for nearly 25 years, I've had, some of my staff say, why do we continue to work within a construct that was never designed for full participation? And so all the things that we might do in terms of democracy reform are really just tinkering with a broken system. And again, is it broken or is it designed, operating in the way it was designed? And so there's that. There's the people who feel like, yes, we have an opportunity to reform the system, but also the transformation that's needed is something completely different. And, where is our thinking and our dreaming around that? So I would just say, since we're dealing with the current system that we have, I think just some of the ways we can make it better is to ensure that there's ease of accessibility in order to really create or remove those barriers. And I think places like Pennsylvania, who have really tried to codify and enshrine voting rights, is an important step. But there's also a host of states that have created more anti-voter bills since in the last couple of years. And again, I think about this example, like I mentioned earlier, where you've had historic turnout, and the pandemic actually showed us what's possible, right? You had the threat of, health access and all the things with the pandemic. And so what did we do? We made it easier to vote. We made vote by mail. We made we did all these things to ensure that people had access. But now we've snatched all those things back for, a false narrative of security and all of those things. And what I say in my essay is that, I've been in Georgia for over 2 decades and moved to Jersey. And, I pulled out my voter ID and they're like, we don't take that here. That's not necessary. It's a barrier. Like, woo! Who knew, it's possible, right? And I think one of the other things to underscore is that we're all interacting in our democracy differently depending on our zip code, depending on where we live, and quite honestly, what skin we're in. And so I think, again, making sure that we can access the ballot in the most easy ways. And I think one of your state reps, I got to hear my notes, or actually one of your county commissioners, Neil Makia, says, imagine if voting was as efficient and accessible as getting an Amazon delivery or calling an Uber. Exercising fundamental rights shouldn't be a burden and burdensome, but it is. And I think also the other issue is once you have unfettered access to the ballot, and of course there are a host of ways, same-day voter, automatic voter, like all those different types of registration issues. And for those of us, like Dr. Blain, who is a student of history and has studied, registration was a barrier in the first place because we didn't want, everyone to be able to do it. But we've also got to get big money out of politics. We don't have the kind of representation that is truly representative of the people, say Representative Richardson here. And so I think in places like New York City and Seattle and DC and Baltimore that have created these small donor public financing programs so you actually can have representative government where, public financing is helping people be able to run and represent their communities. And that's something we need to continuously invest in and innovate around. And I'll stop there, but I think there's a host of interventions here in PA and then nationally. I've heard from many of our movement partners that as they are working at the state level, because democracy is seen and felt in every state legislature, right? And there's been real concern about the lack of federal legislation, and we're all still waiting for Freedom to Vote and John Lewis Advancement Act, which would help really standardize some of the national election processes. So a lot of folks are like, federal government help to create the kind of model that we can all work in our states. But until that happens, we've got to be able to work in the battleground, which is every state legislature, to be able to protect voting access for folks.
Could I just ask for a very quick follow-up? You do pay some attention to incarcerated folks in that essay as well, and I was really glad to see you call out the way that pretrial detention is such a barrier in and of itself to the vote. And I think, as all of us probably know in the room, Pennsylvania locks up more of its people than a lot of other states, and disproportionately Black folks in the states. And so I'm wondering if you could just take a quick minute to also tell us about what kinds of interventions you see as necessary to protect the vote for people who are incarcerated.
Thank you for that. I think a big element of it is voter education. I mean, I know that we've talked about what are the ways in which right now voter education is largely dependent upon the community, community-based movement or philanthropic efforts to help, do civic engagement work. But at the same time, often, particularly in this issue, we just need to enfranchise citizens who have been incarcerated. And unfortunately, people don't know that they can vote, right? So one, we need to abolish and enforce the laws that you already have around that. And I think if in my notes here, it gave me a quote around how many people have been disenfranchised just because they don't know. But enfranchising Pennsylvanians in the criminal legal system, there's only 2 states today that allow prison voting. And many states still count people in prisons, though, for drawing voting maps, right? So we do prison gerrymandering, we count them, but then we don't count them, right? And so I think that is, contributing to this 2-tiered criminal justice system as well, and a 2-tiered voting system. So I think it's really important that we automatically restore people's voting rights when they leave prison, like Michigan did recently, and Florida also did, but then had the clapback from that as well. But I do think right now in Pennsylvania, people can vote who have been systems impacted, and they just aren't showing up.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to move on to you, Representative Richardson. Can I still call you Representative Richardson?
You can call me former.
Former
The
Representative
artist
Richardson.
known formally as Representative Richardson.
The representative formerly known as Representative Richardson. So your essay is largely about violence against Black women and girls, and you spent a lot of your term really focusing on that issue, it sounds like, as well. And you offer this really broad way for us to understand all the different kinds of violence that Black women and girls face. You write, quote, "Violence against Black women was institutionalized in the founding of this nation, and that harmful, traumatic legacy of violence continues today. Black women in the United States experience among the highest rates of physical violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, incarceration, homicide, maternal mortality, and family separation through child welfare policing policies." And you include the school to prison pipeline in there too. Can you talk about how our current structures of democracy contribute to or hide this immense violence? And then, is this still on? Yeah, sorry. And then alternatively, how we can use the structures of democracy to combat that violence?
Yeah, I would say that one of the ways that our current system hides these issues is that they don't talk about them as violence. When we think about the Black maternal health crisis, is it really a crisis when it's completely manufactured and it's completely preventable? And I think those are the points that, as we think about it from not only a democracy perspective, but also thinking about it from a systems perspective, it is about what these systems have been built to tolerate. And I think it's so important when you talk about this, because it's not about our systems being broken. It's about our systems working just the way that they were designed to work, and we're getting the outcomes that they were designed to get. Because the outcomes are not surprises. They are predictable outcomes of systems that are working the way that they were designed to work. When you think about the history of obstetrics within this country, and you think about how that was developed on the brutality of enslaved Black women, and you fast forward to today, and we hear the national statistics about Black women being 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes. And you can begin to go look state by state. And what we also know is that in states that have the most restrictive abortion restrictions, those numbers are even higher. In Iowa, one of the states that Planned Parenthood North Central States is within, Black women are 6 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause. That's violence. When you can have a system that is literally killing us without any response. And when we know that more than 84% of those deaths are preventable, I don't know how to explain that except by saying that it is in fact violence. When we talk about the fact that we have homicide rates in this country where 4 to 5 Black women die a day within the United States, Black women are 6 times more likely to die from homicide. And between 2022 and 2023, the cold case rate of homicide for Black women grew 89% over the previous 2-year period. And that's more than any other demographic. And so when you have a system that not only allows cold cases to grow at such a rate, it sends a message to communities that put a target on the back of Black women. Some of the most chilling sort of interviews that I've ever read have been from convicted human traffickers. And some of the things that they talk about is why they target Black women and girls. And it includes things such as, we know people are less likely to look for them. And if I got caught, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna get less time than if I'm trafficking a white woman. So to just sort of understand the way that our systems are ingraining this within our society. And so you see where Black women are more likely to experience sexual assault. In Minnesota, we saw we're less than 7% of the population in Minnesota, but we make up more than 40% of the reported domestic violence cases. And that's reported. So I would say it's even higher than that, because there's lots of reasons that people would not report those cases. And so from a democracy perspective, it's about what are we willing to tolerate within the systems? And we are willing to tolerate a lot when it comes to Black women and girls. And that is why this work is so important, because we know better. It doesn't have to be this way, and we should be doing better.
Thank you. Can I follow up and ask a little bit, if you can say something more about the Missing and Murdered Black Women and Girls Task Force that you were a part of, what it is and the work that it was doing?
Well, yeah, I can actually also share some really good news, because when I was working on this chapter, we had just successfully wrapped up the Missing and Murdered Black Women and Girls Task Force. And the task force was the first of its kind in the nation that was really set up to begin to bring some answers to our state around how impacted Black women and girls are. When I started this work back in 2019, the estimates in the United States was that there were somewhere between 64,000 and 75,000 Black women and girls that were missing within the United States. And that chilled me, because that told me we don't even know how many Black women and girls are missing within the US, because there's a big difference between 64,000 and 75,000. And fast forward to today, there's over 100,000 Black women and girls that are missing within the United States. And so when I started digging in Minnesota to try to understand how many Black women and girls were impacted in Minnesota, I got a spreadsheet from our Bureau of Criminal Apprehensions, and it had the name of 200 Black women and girls that were on the list that were identified as cold cases for missing person cases, but it only went back 12 months. So there's not even a record, right? So really be able to say. So the task force was so important because it put us on the pathway to really begin to look at a number of these issues to try to understand where are the gaps, because it's hard to solve for something that you can't even measure, right? So, but I'm really excited that last year, after a fight, and it was a fight over several sessions, was able to finally get past the nation's first office for missing and murdered Black women and girls within Minnesota. And thank you. And they're in the process of building that office out, and not only will they have investigatory services around cold cases for not only missing person cases, but for homicide cases as well, training for law enforcement, for media, because our cases stay open 4 times longer than other people's cases, and there's no justification. for that. And there are so many kind of barriers that our families are experiencing when their loved ones go missing, and many are being forced to do their own investigations. And so I'm also really excited that at the federal level, because we've been calling for this for years, there is finally a bill to establish a national office of missing and murdered Black women and girls.
That's really great. Thank you for sharing that. Wow, and we've gotten into a lot of the different details inside the book and in your essays now. I want to zoom back out for one more question before we open it to the audience. And that is, so this will be for all of you. I'm curious about what you think the future of democracy is. So given what each of you sees and the community work you do, the research work you do, the policy work you do, what are you expecting of democracy in the months and years ahead?
That's such a great question. And my thought goes immediately to Fannie Lou Hamer, of course, the inspiration for the title of this book. There's a quote from Hamer that I just love. It's one of my favorites. She said, "You can pray until you faint, but unless you get up and try to do something, God is not going to put it in your lap." And I love that quote for so many reasons. I especially love her boldness because she expressed those words at a church service. So I just love it, how she confronts, right, the people of faith to say, yes, prayer matters, but let's do more than praying. Because ultimately, we know that faith without works is dead. And I think about that in the question of what the future holds. Well, the future, the answer to that is it's really up to us. We can definitely look at the landscape in front of us and say things are not looking great. There are so many challenges. Even when it comes to the presidential election, I've heard so many people say that they're not motivated to vote, that they plan to sit this one out. And that's a choice. I think it's a dangerous one, but I think the ultimate answer is that whatever we do will determine where this goes. So we could put up our hands and say there's nothing left to do, or we could keep fighting the way that Hamer fought, the way that so many others fought. And back to Hamer, right before, I think about this a lot, right before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, there was so much, I think, a feeling of exhaustion, a feeling of disappointment. Hamer gave this electrifying speech in August of '64 at the Democratic National Convention, and it didn't go the way she wanted it to go. And yet, so many things changed following those developments. She didn't have a crystal ball. She couldn't tell in that moment where it appeared that things had been defeated. She could not tell that victory was around the corner, but victory was around the corner. And so I think about that even at this moment where it doesn't feel great. How do we know that it's not just one more wall to break? To see the change we want to see. So if we give up now, we'll never really know. And so I think the answer is that it's up to us, and that's the challenge of the book, is to say to all of us, we hold the keys. We really do. It's in our hands. At least for now, it's in our hands. And so we should absolutely do whatever we can, whether it's in our communities. It doesn't mean taking on the world on your shoulder. Collaborate with the groups, with the organizations that are working. Of course, we're talking about even just represented on the stage. If you don't have to have all the answers, but you can support the work that Taifa's doing at Demos. For example, you can align yourself with groups that are committed to ensuring that there's greater access to the vote, as just one example. But the key is to do something and not solely praying. Praying is something, certainly, but we have to do more than that. And so I hope that this conversation tonight will encourage all of us to be thinking about what we can do to ensure that we don't just sit by and watch a democracy collapse in front of us, but we fight with everything we've got to save it.
Yeah, and I think to just sort of to build upon that in terms of, you know, I recall when Michelle Obama made the statement about voting like your life depends on it, because it really does in so many ways, and like feeling that really deeply within this space, and with so many hard things all happening at the same time, I know that there is sort of this just like general exhaustion that has set in. And for communities and for Black women in general, we think about oftentimes like what's on our shoulders and the burden of that. It can, in times like this, feel very easy to think about giving up, and that what we are doing doesn't matter. And it's within those spaces that I really think about kind of the legacy of my ancestors. I'm the great-great-granddaughter of enslaved peoples. I am the granddaughter of a traditional Black midwife. I'm the granddaughter of sharecroppers, and my parents grew up as child workers in the fields in Mississippi and Alabama. Those were Black women who were going through some things. And in the space of like all the things that they were going for, they showed up for community. My great-grandmother, who was a midwife, it's like she was a financial planner with people. She was a, you know, loaning folks money, marriage counselor, healer, and therapist. It's like all of those things in spaces that were really hard and that were really difficult. And to be in this space today as a grandmother with a granddaughter who has less rights than the rights that I grew up with is for me that calling to say that I have to hold my line in this chain and continue to fight. And I think that what's so important about this work, and when we think about this focus, particularly for Black women, if we're doing better, that means everybody is going to be doing better.
I love that point. And I think, you know, for me in this work, in such a critical time in history, and I just remember a city manager of Philadelphia, that's where I'm from. I had an opportunity to serve as a city manager for a day when I was 16, and he said the life of a public servant is not about having your name in lights. It's about solving public problems. And I just think about all the problem solvers that I've been around, whether they've been in seats of power, making the decisions to actually change systems, or they've been on the outside agitating to make the difference. And I just think in this moment now, I'm really, you know, it is sobering to see where we are, and you know, in terms of like the generational moment where, to your point about Dobbs and all these other privileges that we've had that have been either undermined or taken away, or the threat of that happening. And it just continues to make me think about how do we do this work together in all the different ways. We were talking about this in the pre-room, in the green room, brown room, whatever room downstairs, Alex, is that it is going to take all of us. And I think about the work of Demos, that it has largely been around building the multiracial coalition. And we know that within the civil rights movement, it took white, brown, yellow, all of us side by side, armed together to fight against white supremacy and all the things that show up in our society that keep us all from experiencing the equality and the liberty that we all want. And as I think about Black and brown leaders right now in the field, in the movement, that continue to have their North Star be liberation, that's the thing that encourages me. And I think, you know, for those of us who are in places, in these very privileged places, to talk about public policy and systems change, to really be able to push on the political apparatus, right, you know, of the policymakers, to give them the ideas, to give them the solutions, that's very important. But I remember doing this work in Georgia, and a lawmaker said to me, well, you know, Taifa, that's all cool. Your report on what we should do, that's fine. But I haven't heard from my constituents on this. So it is critical that we have the public will push on the political. And that's where movement and civic engagement and all the things that we do in our communities to make sure that we're aligned, that people understand the threats, they understand the opportunities, and they can go and push on those that are making the decisions. So that's the thing that excites me. We have a ton of movement partners who are passing voting rights amendment acts in their own states, in Minnesota, in Connecticut, New York, New Mexico. They are like declaring what they want for their communities, and we must continue to support them. Philanthropy has to support that sort of civic engagement infrastructure, which is a really, really critical piece. And I think folks like Black leaders organizing communities in Wisconsin are showing us that year-round civic engagement canvassing by young people, teenagers, is an important model that not only engages our youth and gets them connected, but that we stay in community all year round, not just during election season. So we can keep our ears to the ground of hearing what people really care about. What are the challenges that they're experiencing, and taking that into state houses and saying, fix this, right? So that's the thing that excites me, that no matter how gloom and doom it is, we have our eyes on the prize of liberation, and we know that it's going to take every last person in this room. People of color can't be the sole champions. We need all of us lockstep understanding that the society that we want is being undermined right now by forces that are well-resourced because of this rising demographic. And I'll just say this finally, and I can't remember if I said this in the start. Again, taking this role, thinking about the majority people of color nation that the United States is projected to be. If nothing fundamentally changes in our systems, we will have white minority rule. We will have apartheid in America. And that's not going to happen on my watch. So that's what keeps me at the table.
Thank you all so much for those calls to action. We're going to move to Q&A in just a second, but please give everybody a round of applause.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll come around with the mic. Who wants to be first? No one. Yes.
For a doctor, I was just thinking, where are you going? Where's your headspace? Where are you going from going to now? Like, what's the next project or next book you're working on to follow up with this?
Yeah, so I've been working on a book on human rights. I'm essentially telling the story or the history of human rights through the ideas and experiences of Black women in the United States from the early 19th century to the present. So it's a big project. I'm literally writing it. I was working on a chapter earlier today, and so that book is projected to be out in 2025. And I started writing that book really during the uprisings, and at the times, 2020, I think, and even the year before, so many people kept asking me, well, how do we historicize, how do we contextualize what's happening in this nation, what's happening across the globe, how people are coming together to condemn state-sanctioned violence, how do we contextualize this moment? Initially I would draw these links, of course, between Black Lives Matter and the Black Power movement, and I would draw connections to individuals like Malcolm X, for example, and just the way that I saw a movement for Black lives building upon these earlier thinkers. And what became very clear to me, even as I thought about these connections, was no surprise that Black women were so many times at the forefront of these movements, even though they were not receiving the recognition for their work. In talking to people about human rights in particular, which is something that I found so fascinating. I was a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I would talk to people about my previous book on Fannie Lou Hamer, and I would talk about her as a civil rights activist, but also as a human rights activist, and I would talk about Black women and the way that they're so crucial in the history, and so many people would look at me somewhat puzzled because to them, Black women are not in the story at all. And I would say, well, how can you talk about human rights without Ida B. Wells? Well, apart from those who looked at me like, Ida B. who? So I think at the moment I thought, rather than complain about what people don't know, let me write the book that'll answer the question. So I certainly had those conversations trying to make a case that Black women are part of the story. Even if we talk about the United Nations, for example, you can't talk about the history of the United Nations without talking about Mary McLeod Bethune, for example. You can't talk about, just so many of the things we think we know about human rights without going right back to all of these Black women organizing on the ground and having such immense impact on the global scale. So this book is essentially the way that I bring all of these narratives together, and very ambitious. And so I've been plugging at it for the last few years, but it's almost done. I look forward to sharing it with all of you. And maybe I'll come back here to talk about it. So thank you for that.
So, sorry. First of all, thank you all so much for everything that you all brought this evening. So I have a two-part question. One is for you all as writers. What did you learn from the process of contributing to this, for writing your essay or working through the volume? And the second part is, as readers, what's on your bookshelf right now?
So one, I love to write, but I don't have time to do it. So this was an opportunity to actually sit down and really carve out what I wanted to say. And of course, for those of you who know people in positions like this, we have people to help write us write. But I really was excited about weaving the story of my daughter in this piece because, again, it was showing like the reality of how this engagement as a civic duty happens to us all. And so I'm looking to do more of it in my life. But in terms of what's on my shelf, there's a whole lot. And our staff is doing, and I'm hosting a talk next month. I haven't started the book, but Black AF, Black AF History by Michael Harriot. Yes, that's one. And then this book, I think, will spark a lot more of my thinking about what else to read. But that was the one that I'm going to enjoy. And I just finished, for those of you who haven't read, I'm going to look at, I just talked to Janae Jabali, her book on It's Not You, It's Capitalism. Yeah, it was a great piece.
You had people to help. See, I need to talk to you. For growing up, I used to write a lot, but I never really thought about it was just for me. It wasn't for others. And so with this feeling, I sort of left feeling like, okay, I think I might be an author now, but I'm still not quite sure about that. But in terms of like what's on my shelf, Dorothy Roberts, Torn Apart, on like really the child protection policing system and just like that recognition for Black families, how this legacy of family separation continues. And the other thing that I have on my, I've got Cast on my bookshelf, and I haven't read it yet, but I've got that waiting, and Medical Bondage is one that I've been spending a lot of time with recently. And every time I go back to it, it really has me sort of thinking about where we are right now. And, we talk a lot about the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe versus Wade, but we also have to acknowledge the landscape wasn't that great when we had Roe versus Wade. And so also just like that recognition of what we saw after Roe was overturned, and we saw lots of people taking to the streets. And for me, it was sort of this moment as I'm the founder of the Black Maternal Health Caucus within our state, and we penned an open letter after Roe was overturned because that action that we saw, we were asking, where has this been when we talk about the Black maternal health crisis? That's not new, right? And so I think for people, it's like, okay, now it's getting on me. So now that it's personal, we feel this and we see this, but it's just sort of that reminder about the interconnectedness of all of this. Because if if some of us aren't free, none of us are.
And if I could just go back to It's Not You, It's Capitalism. It's by Malika Javali. It's a great book about breaking up with capitalism because, it has not fulfilled the promise. And the last one I just finished reading was Allow Me to Retort by Elie Mystal, A Black Man's Guide to the Constitution.
So I'll just speak briefly about the experience of working with the authors. After I finished working, Ibram and I edited 400 Souls together, and that was just huge, working with 90 different authors. And after that, I said, I'm done. I'm not editing any more collections. It's too much work. It's exhausting. So never say never. And I had this idea for this collection. I knew it would be a challenge, but I have to say, the group of writers, just wonderful. It's always interesting, I think, as an editor, when you're taking someone's essay and then marking it up, and it can be a little uncomfortable. But I'm grateful that when I sent back comments and suggestions for revisions, I did get some pushback. Yeah, definitely got into it with some folks. It was kind of funny. I can laugh about it now, but we not these two. You're amazing. So, but for the most part, people were just really, they were ready to go, ready, to revise and to make the changes, and it is a give and take. You sort of have, as an editor, you know what you want out of each piece, but you also want to make sure that you're not getting in the way of an individual's voice. So it's a delicate touch of both accomplishing your goal, your overall goal, but respecting each individual author. And so I have to say, just truly a blessing to have worked with both of you and just everyone who contributed. And in terms of what I'm reading, I just started reading Tanisha Ford's new book. I just pulled it up to get the full title. It's a long title, but it is a great book. It's called Our Secret Society, Molly Moon and the Glamour, Money, and Power Behind the Civil Rights Movement. So earlier I was talking about, everyone's always talking about civil rights movement, and here I am talking about, read a book on the civil rights movement. So there you go, the complexity of life. But thank you all, it's been wonderful to be here.
Thank you for coming to Harrisburg. Thank you for providing enough to think about and act upon for the next several decades. So let me share a proposition I heard from John Bracey. John Bracey was an African American, you know John Bracey, okay, at UMass Amherst. So the proposition is this: political democracy will always be fraudulent without economic democracy. So if you could comment on that, and if you think that's correct, how do we start moving toward economic democracy?
That is such a great question, and Demos just embarked upon a project over the last couple of years on economic democracy, not a new term, but certainly something we believe is really important to ensure that people have control over these economic forces that influence their lives each and every day. And we did a series of case studies to show within communities how they were exercising economic democracy in real, tangible ways. And one of the most exciting ones is not too far from here, Pittsburgh United, as a community that was fighting against, let me just say this. The three principles that we had within that economic democracy framework was decreasing and decentralizing corporate power, ensuring that we can reach what public goods needs to be like in this country, and then 3, increasing more models of co-governance. Because again, we want to make sure that the people, the demos, have a seat at the table, right? Making the decisions that impact them, and that they're beneficiaries of those decisions that they make. And And just real quick, Pittsburgh United worked with their Our Water campaign because part of neoliberalism, as you know, government was like, we're going to stop doing stuff and give it to private corporations. So they had a water crisis in Pittsburgh. Water was privatized by a company that just so happened to be the same water company in Flint that created their water crisis. Long story short, they fought to get water back in the public domain and created a co-governance structure where the citizens work with the water authority to make sure that the citizens had a say in terms of this public good that is so important. And that's where we show we can see tangible ways that when the citizens take control, when the people have control, it's better for them ultimately. And one of the things that Demos has always underscored is that economic power and political power are inextricably linked. And I am so tired of having these conversations at different tables. The economic justice folks are over here, the political economy and the politics, the democracy conversations are over here. And like you said, they are interconnected. And I love the book by Manuel Pastor and Chris Brenner out of University of Southern California. Also on my shelf is Solidarity Economics. And they really talk about how our economy and our democracy are one. And so how do we think about that? And part of what we're trying to do at Demos in the next year is to launch a power agenda. Part of the new mission of our organization is really about how do we build political and economic power. And what my hope is that we can be very explicit, not exclusive, but explicit, that we have to build that political and economic power for Black and brown folks. And if we can do that, we can ensure that corporations have less influence, the people, the demos, have more control over our political, apparatus and our economy, and we can get to the multiracial democracy. So your point is well taken and right on. We've got to make sure that our economy also has more control by the people.
We'll go to one last question, then we got to wrap up.
Good evening, you all. Thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts. The question that I have is just thinking about the upcoming election that's happening in a few months. And I know that in the past election cycles, we have seen everything from claims of hot sauce in bags to putting on black scents and things like that. I'm really kind of wondering what sorts of things are you looking to see or looking to hear from people who are running to really show that they have a commitment to Black women and bettering our lives, interrupting some of the violence that we see happening? What are some of the things that you're hoping to see and hear?
When I first made the decision to run for office in 2018, and in the book I talk about myself being an accidental politician because there was no strategy that got me here. I got into the race 2 weeks before caucuses, and there was someone who had been running for the Democratic endorsement for a year, so not the way to get into a race, and not the way that I was just anyone to do this. But when I was running, I made a decision that if I was going to do this, I was going to run as my authentic self, and I was going to talk about the issues that were the most important to me. And if that resonated with people, great. If it didn't, then I'm not the person that would be best to represent you. And coming in, I heard from a lot of people because I was running in a district that was 96% white. They're like, you can't be talking about this Black woman stuff. And someone told me, don't tell them you're a Black woman. And I said, I feel like they're gonna know. But the point was, as I was running and everyone was telling me, there's no way you can win. And then to flip a seat, go to the Capitol, and to be able to push forward a Black agenda, and to the point that you're making, it is about doing this work with community and being able to, I think one of the things that I'm most proud of in my time within the legislature, we were the first chamber to declare racism a public health crisis. I chief authored House Resolution number 1. I even got bipartisan votes. I got 6 votes on the other side. And it created the House Select Committee on Racial Justice. And that began this process of working with community and having community come in and tell us what they needed within their community. And from that, it set up a report with 83 recommendations that didn't come from us. They came from the community. And I think that that is what we should be looking for, because when we think about that ability to really be able to co-lead with community, that's really important. And that's not the way that this usually works. Our system was designed by a bunch of dudes that didn't like their families and they didn't want to go home. So you sit on House floors for 24 hours, 62 hours, 72 hours. And I think it's also this opportunity for us to think about like what do we want to build, as opposed to trying to tinker with this system that isn't working. And so being able to come in and reimagine the way that we do work. And let me tell you, it was scary for people because they're like, where'd you get this bill from? I work with community. And they're like, that's not the way it works here. We work with lobbyists. I was like, I don't. So that's, in my opinion, that's what you should be looking for.
Mic drop.
We've got to wrap up. Dr. Blain, did you have any closing remarks that you wanted to say?
No, I just wanted to reiterate my thanks to everyone. It's truly a joy to be here. And I mentioned this on social media that the first book event that I had was here when I published my very first book, Set the World on Fire. So this is such a special place for me. Love coming here, love being with all of you. And so thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks again, everyone, for coming out. We're going to have a book signing. We've got books available for purchase up at the cafe. Our authors will be over here at this table. Thank you, Say. Thank you, Keisha. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Taifa. And everyone, have a wonderful evening. Thank you.